When my husband calmly told me he'd be spending the holidays with his ex, and taking my stepdaughter with him, I didn't argue. I smiled and said I understood. Everyone thought I was being mature. What they didn't know was that decision would expose everything wrong in our marriage. 3 days later, he called me in tears, saying nothing felt right, that the house was tense, that he missed me. But by then, I wasn't waiting at home anymore. I had made a choice of my own, one that forced him to finally see what my silence had been hiding for years. That he said it the way someone mentions the weather, casual, almost thoughtful. We were in the kitchen, late evening, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. He leaned against the counter and said, "So, I've been thinking, this year, I'll spend the holidays with my ex. And my daughter will be with us." He didn't look at me when he said it. He said it like the decision was already made. For a second, I thought I'd misunderstood. Holidays were our thing. Messy breakfasts, inside jokes, staying in pajamas too long. I waited for him to add something, an explanation, an apology, "We'll celebrate later." Instead, he kept talking, explaining schedules and logistics, as if he were solving a simple puzzle. I stood there, holding a dish towel, nodding without realizing I was nodding. He finally looked up, watching my face closely, almost testing me. "You're okay with that, right?" The question wasn't really a question. It was a checkpoint. A chance for me to do what I always did, make things easy. I felt something tighten in my chest, but my voice stayed calm. I said, "Yeah. If that's what you think is best." The relief on his face came instantly. He smiled, thanked me for being understanding, and moved on to talking about travel plans. Just like that, the conversation shifted. The moment passed. But something in me didn't move on. It stayed right there, in the kitchen, lodged between what I felt and what I said. That night, lying in bed beside him, I stared at the ceiling while he slept peacefully. The holidays were approaching fast, and somehow, without an argument or a fight, I had been written out of them. And the scariest part wasn't that he suggested it, it was how easily I agreed. The next morning, he brought it up again, this time with more confidence, like he'd rehearsed it overnight. We were sitting at the table with our coffee, sunlight stretching across the floor. He said he wanted to explain himself, as if the explanation would make the ache disappear. "It's important for her," he told me, stirring his cup slowly. "She deserves real family time during the holidays." I listened, quiet, as he framed it like a noble sacrifice. He talked about stability, about how confusing it could be for a child to move between houses. He said his ex and him were finally getting along, that it was better for everyone. Better for his daughter. Better for the holidays. The word better kept landing between us, heavy and final. What he didn't say was just as loud. He didn't say, "You're her family too." He didn't say, "We'll find a way to include you." Instead, I felt myself shrinking as he spoke, reduced to a reasonable adult who would understand. I nodded at the right moments, asking soft questions, making it easy for him to believe this plan was fair. When he finished, he looked relieved again, like he'd passed a test. "You're amazing, you know that," he said, reaching for my hand. I smiled, because that was the role I'd learned to play. The supportive wife. The flexible stepmom. The one who didn't complicate things. But inside, something shifted. His words kept echoing, "She deserves real family time." I wondered where that left me. I wondered when being understanding slowly turned into being invisible. And I wondered why no one ever asked what I deserved. People always assume silence means agreement, but for me, it was something I'd learned over time. Arguing never felt safe. Early in our marriage, I noticed how quickly small disagreements turned into tension, how defending my feelings made me seem difficult. So I adapted. I learned when to speak and, more importantly, when not to. I told myself that love meant compromise, and compromise meant letting go of things that mattered to me. I wasn't his daughter's biological mother, so I tried to stay in my lane. I smiled through changes in plans, cancelled traditions, and last-minute adjustments. Every time I swallowed my disappointment, I convinced myself I was doing the right thing, for the family, for the peace. There was also fear underneath it all. Fear that pushing back would make me the outsider. Fear that if I asked for more, I'd be told I was asking too much. I didn't want to be the reason things became complicated. I didn't want to be the villain in a story where everyone else was just doing their best. So when he said they'd spend the holidays with his ex, my instinct wasn't to fight, it was to protect. Protect the fragile balance we'd built. Protect my place, however small it felt. Saying yes felt safer than risking rejection. Silence felt like survival. What I didn't realize then was that every time I chose silence, I was quietly teaching him something. I was teaching him that my feelings were optional. That my absence was acceptable. And that lesson would come back to haunt both of us in ways neither of us expected. Once I stopped replaying that conversation in my head, other moments started surfacing, ones I'd carefully filed away and told myself didn't matter. Birthdays where plans changed at the last minute. Weekends rearranged to accommodate someone else's schedule. Holidays split into awkward halves where I smiled through disappointment and called it maturity. At the time, each compromise felt small. Reasonable, even. He always had an explanation ready, and I always wanted to be the one who understood. I told myself that blending families required flexibility, that love meant sacrifice. And maybe it does, but not always from the same person. There were subtle things too. Conversations that didn't include me. Decisions that were already made before I heard about them. I'd find out after the fact, expected to adjust without question. If I hesitated, the room would shift, and I'd feel that quiet pressure to be agreeable. I started measuring my role by how little space I took up. The easier I was, the smoother things ran. I became proud of how adaptable I could be, how little I needed. But beneath that pride was something heavier, a growing sense that my presence was convenient, not essential. Looking back, the holiday decision wasn't sudden. It was the result of years of small moments stacked on top of each other. I just hadn't allowed myself to see the pattern. It was easier to call it love than to admit I was slowly disappearing inside it. The packing started a few days later, quietly, like this was all perfectly normal. Suitcases appeared in the hallway, half-zipped, waiting to be filled. His daughter moved between rooms with excited energy, talking about plans I wasn't part of. I helped anyway, folding sweaters, finding missing chargers, making sure nothing was forgotten. He thanked me each time, quick and distracted, already mentally somewhere else. I nodded, handed him clothes, reminded him about medication and documents. I was efficient. Calm. Helpful. From the outside, it probably looked like acceptance. Inside, it felt like I was assisting in my own erasure. At one point, I picked up a scarf I'd bought for his daughter weeks earlier, planning to give it to her on Christmas morning. I folded it carefully and placed it in the suitcase, then hesitated. There was no space for me in that moment, no place where my presence belonged. The scarf disappeared under layers of clothes, and something in my chest tightened. They talked about travel times and weather forecasts, laughing, making inside jokes. I stood in the doorway, listening, smiling when expected. No one asked if I wanted to come. No one said we'd celebrate together later. The assumption was complete. I was staying behind. When the suitcases finally closed, the sound felt final. Zippers sealing not just bags, but a decision that had already been made without me. I realized then that I wasn't just missing a holiday. I was being left out of a life I was already living in. The realization didn't hit all at once. It slipped in quietly, disguised as something small. He was on the phone with his ex, standing near the window, his voice softer than usual. I wasn't trying to listen, but the words floated toward me anyway. details about dinner plans, a guest list, traditions they'd always done. Traditions I'd never been part of. After he hung up, he walked past me without mentioning the call. No explanation. No update. Just an unspoken understanding that this was none of my business. That's when it settled in. This wasn't a shared holiday I was choosing to skip. It was a separate world, one that didn't have room for me in it. Later that evening, I saw a group photo notification pop up on his phone while it sat charging on the counter. A picture of the three of them from years ago, smiling, close, complete. My name wasn't attached to the message. I wasn't tagged. I wasn't even a thought. I told myself not to overreact. I reminded myself that co-parenting required flexibility, that I was being mature. But maturity shouldn't feel like erasure. It shouldn't make you question where you fit in your own marriage. That night, I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual, searching my reflection for an answer. I looked like someone who belonged there, someone who had built a life inside those walls. And yet, in the plans being made, I didn't exist. That was the moment it became clear. I wasn't being temporarily excluded. I had never truly been included at all. Once I admitted the truth to myself, I couldn't unsee it. Every polite smile, every calm response, every, "it's fine," I'd ever said lined up in my head like evidence. I hadn't been forced into this situation. I had agreed to it, piece by piece, long before the holidays were ever mentioned. I kept replaying the moment in the kitchen when he asked if I was okay with the plan. That was my chance. I could have spoken up. I could have said I felt hurt or excluded. Instead, I chose comfort over honesty. I chose peace over being seen. At the time, it felt like the responsible thing to do. There was a strange guilt that came with that realization. If I was angry, who was I really angry at? Him, for assuming I'd step aside. Or myself, for making it so easy. Accepting the truth hurt more than the original decision. I started to understand how silence can become permission. Every time I stayed quiet, I taught him what I would tolerate. Not because he was cruel, but because I never corrected the pattern. I made myself small and called it love. Agreeing didn't make me kind or selfless. It made me invisible. And once I saw that, I knew I couldn't keep pretending this was just another compromise. Something had already shifted inside me, and there was no going back to who I'd been before I said yes. The house felt different the moment the door closed behind them. Not peaceful, hollow. Their voices disappeared, and the silence rushed in to take their place. I stood there for a few seconds, listening to nothing, as if my body hadn't caught up to the fact that I was alone. I moved through the room slowly, noticing details I usually ignored. A forgotten mug on the counter. A jacket draped over a chair. The faint smell of his cologne lingering in the hallway. Everything reminded me that life had continued, just without me included in it. Outside, the neighborhood was glowing with holiday lights. Cars passed, families headed somewhere together. Inside, I heated leftovers and ate standing up, the television on only for background noise. I didn't feel dramatic sadness. I felt small. Unnecessary. That night, I sat on the couch and stared at the Christmas decorations I'd put up weeks earlier. The tree looked too big for the room now. I wondered why I'd decorated at all. Who it was really for. I slept on my side of the bed, the space beside me untouched. I expected to cry, but the tears didn't come. Instead, there was a quiet clarity settling in. For the first time, I wasn't busy accommodating anyone else. I was finally alone with the truth. The first morning I woke up alone, I reached for my phone out of habit. No messages. No updates. No, "we miss you." I stared at the screen longer than I should have, then set it down and realized something uncomfortable. I had been waiting. Waiting to be acknowledged. Waiting to matter. And I was tired of waiting. So I did something different. I opened my laptop and pulled up a document I hadn't touched in months. Notes I'd written to myself, plans I'd postponed, decisions I'd kept on hold because they weren't convenient for anyone else. I started reading them slowly, like I was meeting myself again after a long absence. By the afternoon, I had made calls I'd been putting off. I confirmed an appointment. I updated paperwork. I made practical choices that didn't involve anyone else's approval. It wasn't dramatic. There were no ultimatums. Just quiet, intentional movement in a direction I'd been avoiding. That evening, I booked a short holiday trip for myself. Nothing extravagant, just a place where no one knew me as someone who was always flexible. When the confirmation email arrived, my hands shook slightly. Not from fear, but from relief. I didn't tell him. Not out of spite, but because for once, I didn't feel the need to explain myself. While he was recreating old memories, I was creating new boundaries. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was choosing myself. And for the first time in a long time, that choice felt steady instead of selfish. 3 days into the holiday, my phone finally rang. His name lit up the screen, bright and insistent. I watched it for a moment before answering, surprised by how calm I felt. When I said hello, his voice cracked almost immediately. He sounded exhausted, strained in a way I'd never heard before. He started talking fast, words tumbling over each other. Things weren't going as planned. The house was tense. Old arguments were resurfacing. His ex was frustrated, his daughter was overwhelmed, and nothing felt festive anymore. I didn't think it would be like this, he said, his voice dropping. I thought it would be easier. I listened without interrupting, sitting at the small table in my hotel room. The window beside me showed a quiet street, lights blinking softly. He asked where I was, why I sounded distant. I told him the truth, that I wasn't home. There was a pause on the line, long enough for him to realize he didn't know my plans. When I explained I'd taken a short trip for myself, he went silent again. I could hear him breathing, recalculating. You didn't tell me, he finally said. There was confusion in his tone, not anger. As if the idea of me acting independently had never crossed his mind. I reminded him gently that he hadn't told me everything either. That landed harder than I expected. He apologized, but it sounded incomplete, like someone apologizing for the outcome, not the choice. When the call ended, I stared at the phone in my hand. The power had shifted, and we both felt it. He called again later that night, this time quieter. The edge in his voice was gone, replaced by something heavier. Regret, maybe. Or confusion. He said the holidays felt wrong, that everything he thought would fall into place had instead unraveled. The traditions he remembered didn't feel comforting anymore. They felt forced. He admitted he hadn't realized how much I handled at home. The planning. The emotional balance. The way I softened situations before they turned sharp. Without me there, every small issue seemed to escalate. He said my absence was louder than he expected. I let him talk. I didn't rush to reassure him or fix anything. For once, I wasn't filling the silence. I was listening. And in that quiet, he started hearing himself. He said he missed me. Not just my presence, but the way things felt when I was around. What struck me wasn't the apology, it was the surprise in his voice. As if he was only now discovering the weight I carried. He said, I didn't think it would be like this, again, softer this time. I believed him. And that made it worse. Because it meant he hadn't intended to hurt me. He just hadn't considered me at all. The next morning, his message was longer than usual. No explanations this time, no justifications. He said he'd been thinking all night, replaying conversations, noticing things he'd brushed past before. Moments where I went quiet. Times I stepped back instead of speaking up. He wrote that he used to see my silence as strength. Reading his words, I felt a strange mix of validation and sadness. I had been strong, but not in the way he imagined. I'd been enduring, absorbing, smoothing edges so he wouldn't have to. And because I did it so well, he never saw the cost. He admitted that my silence had made things feel easy. Too easy. He said he thought no complaints meant no pain. That my calm meant consent. It was the first time he acknowledged that quiet doesn't mean unaffected. For the first time, he didn't ask me to fix anything. He didn't ask what he should do next. He simply said he was sorry for assuming I'd always be there, always flexible, always waiting. That message changed something between us. Not because it erased what happened, but because it showed understanding had finally begun. My silence had spoken louder than any argument ever could. And now, he was finally hearing it. When we spoke later that day, I didn't soften my words like I usually did. I told him the truth, calmly and clearly, without anger. I said I'd felt pushed aside for a long time, not just during the holidays. I explained how every quiet compromise added up, how being understanding slowly turned into being invisible. I told him I didn't need to be chosen over his daughter. I needed to be chosen with her. I needed to feel like part of the family, not an optional extra when things got complicated. Saying it out loud felt unfamiliar, almost risky, but also relieving. He listened without interrupting. That alone was new. I explained that agreeing to the holiday plan wasn't generosity, it was exhaustion. I was tired of proving I could handle disappointment gracefully. I was tired of being praised for flexibility instead of being respected. I told him I wasn't threatening to leave. I wasn't demanding apologies or promises. I was setting a line, one I should have drawn years earlier. I said if this marriage was going to continue, it had to include me fully, or not at all. When I finished, my hands were shaking, but my voice hadn't wavered. I realized something important in that moment. Speaking up didn't make me selfish. It made me honest that he didn't answer right away. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, slow and uneven. This wasn't a conversation he could smooth over with good intentions or half-promises. For the first time, there was no easy path forward. He said he needed time to think, and I let him take it. I didn't chase reassurance. I didn't fill the space with explanations. I had already said what mattered. The rest was his responsibility now. Hours passed. Then a message came through. He wrote that he'd been wrong, not just about the holidays, but about the way he'd balanced his past and his present. He admitted he'd avoided discomfort by letting me carry it instead. He said he wanted to come home early. That he needed to fix things properly, not just apologize. I didn't respond immediately. I sat with the message, aware that words were easier than change. In that pause, I understood something clearly. Whatever he chose next would show me everything I needed to know. I had finally stopped convincing him of my worth. Now, he had to decide whether he truly saw I teed up. By the time the holidays ended, nothing felt dramatic anymore. There were no explosive arguments, no grand apologies that fixed everything overnight. What changed was quieter and deeper. I stopped shrinking myself to keep things comfortable. I stopped translating my needs into something easier for others to accept. I realized that love isn't measured by how much pain you can absorb without complaining. It's measured by how much room you're given to exist fully. For years, I confused patience with strength and flexibility with loyalty. I thought being easy made me valuable. It didn't. It made me optional. Setting boundaries didn't turn me cold or selfish. It forced honesty into places where silence had been doing all the work. Some conversations were hard. Some were awkward. But they were real. And real was better than quietly disappearing. I also learned that people don't always intend to hurt you. Sometimes they just get comfortable benefiting from your silence. That doesn't make the damage smaller, but it does make clarity possible. Once I stopped over-explaining and over-giving, the dynamic shifted on its own. I no longer wait to be invited into decisions that affect my life. I expect to be included. I don't negotiate my presence or downplay my feelings to keep the peace. Peace that costs you yourself is too expensive. If there's one thing this experience gave me, it was self-trust. I learned to listen when something feels wrong instead of talking myself out of it. I learned that walking away emotionally, even briefly, can teach people what words never could. The holidays came and went, but that lesson stayed. Love doesn't ask you to disappear. And the moment you stop disappearing, everything becomes clearer, including who is willing to meet you where you stand.